Hey, Vikings fan, the starting job is settled. But now there's an even bigger question hanging over the quarterback room. What happens to the young guy who was supposed to be the future? Does he stay, fight for another opportunity? Or could we actually be heading toward a move nobody expected? There are a few scenarios here that could get really interesting, really fast, so stick with me. And if you're riding with the purple no matter what, hit that like button and drop SKOL in the comments. Something has changed inside the Minnesota Vikings quarterback room, and the biggest question coming out of it may no longer be about Kyler Murray at all. It may be about what happens to J.J. McCarthy now. Murray has been named QB1, and that decision immediately puts McCarthy in one of the most fascinating situations on this roster. Because Minnesota didn't just choose a starter, the Vikings potentially changed the entire trajectory of the quarterback they selected 10th overall. And now comes the uncomfortable question: does J.J. McCarthy still have a future in Minnesota, or are we approaching the point where another NFL team decides it wants to find out what he can become? There is no indication in the information we have that McCarthy has requested a trade. That distinction matters. We shouldn't turn speculation into reporting. But once Murray becomes the unquestioned starter and starts receiving the first-team work, it becomes completely reasonable to examine what Minnesota's options are with McCarthy. And there are teams that could make sense. The Los Angeles Chargers immediately jump onto the list because of one obvious connection: Jim Harbaugh. Harbaugh coached McCarthy at Michigan, where McCarthy won a national championship. If the Chargers decided they needed a better option behind their starter, that existing relationship would make Los Angeles fascinating. Then there are the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The situation presented here revolves around their quarterback depth and Baker Mayfield's contract situation. If Tampa Bay ever found itself needing another quarterback option, McCarthy's name could become interesting. Jacksonville is another potential destination mentioned, with the Jaguars carrying Nick Mullins as a backup and having a connection through Grant Udinsky. The question there would be whether Jacksonville might see McCarthy as young insurance behind Trevor Lawrence. Atlanta was also raised as a possibility, depending on how the Falcons ultimately view their own quarterback room. And then there are the New York Jets. That possibility was presented with considerably more skepticism. But the broader argument is that a franchise without a firmly established long-term answer could at least have reason to evaluate a 23-year-old former top 10 selection. But before anybody starts packing McCarthy's bags, there is another side to this story that might actually be more important. Why would Minnesota sell now? McCarthy's trade value is incredibly difficult to determine. The discussion suggested that a 4th or 5th round pick might represent his current range, with the possibility of that value increasing if he plays well during the preseason. A 3rd round return was floated as something that perhaps becomes conceivable with strong tape. But a 2nd round pick. That appears much harder to imagine under normal circumstances. And that creates a problem for the Vikings. Minnesota invested the 10th overall selection in McCarthy. Moving him for a 4th or 5th only a relatively short time later would mean accepting an enormous decline in value. Unless the Vikings have completely closed the door on his development, there is a legitimate argument that keeping him provides more upside than selling him at what could be the lowest point of his market. That's where the preseason becomes extremely interesting. The expectation discussed was that Murray could receive significant early work against the Giants, potentially the first quarter, before McCarthy gets an extended opportunity during the 2nd and 3rd quarters, with Carson Wentz and Max Brosmer potentially handling the final portion of the game. If that happens, don't treat McCarthy's preseason snaps as meaningless August football. Every throw could matter. Those snaps could serve 2 purposes simultaneously. Minnesota can continue developing a quarterback who is still only 23 years old, while the rest of the NFL gets another opportunity to evaluate him. If McCarthy plays extremely well, Minnesota suddenly has options. Maybe his value increases. Maybe another organization becomes interested. Or maybe something even more important happens. The Vikings themselves start seeing enough progress to reconsider what McCarthy could eventually become. Because naming Murray QB1 does not necessarily mean McCarthy's Minnesota career is finished. In fact, the strongest argument for McCarthy staying might have nothing to do with a future trade, and everything to do with what could happen during this season. If Minnesota had one must-win game and Murray suddenly couldn't play, the expectation presented was that Carson Wentz might currently be the safer choice for that isolated situation. But if Murray were unavailable for an extended stretch, the calculus could become completely different. In that scenario, McCarthy could make much more sense because Minnesota would have an opportunity to put the young quarterback back onto the field and find out whether he can develop into something more. And that possibility cannot be ignored. Murray has had injuries during his NFL career. If he were forced to miss time, and McCarthy got onto the field, played well, and won games, suddenly everything we believe about this quarterback hierarchy could change. Imagine Murray misses a game early in the season. McCarthy gets his opportunity. He plays efficient football, protects the ball, connects with Justin Jefferson, and helps Minnesota win. Then what? That is where this becomes much more complicated than simply saying, Murray won, McCarthy lost, trade McCarthy. The Vikings don't necessarily have to make that decision today. In fact, waiting could be their strongest position. Quarterback situations around the NFL can change incredibly quickly. A team that has no interest in McCarthy today could view him completely differently if its starter becomes unavailable during the season. That is when desperation enters negotiations, and desperation can change trade compensation dramatically. The hypothetical involving Tampa Bay illustrates the point. If a team suddenly lost a starting quarterback for most of the season, perhaps its willingness to pay for McCarthy would look very different from what it does today. That's why Minnesota has little reason to panic, and McCarthy has little reason to panic either. If you're advising him, the argument for staying is straightforward. You already know Kevin O'Connell's offense. You already know these receivers. You already understand this organization. Starting over somewhere else would mean learning a new system, adapting to new coaches, and rebuilding relationships from scratch. Meanwhile, an opportunity could still emerge in Minnesota. There is also a personal challenge here for McCarthy. He can look at Murray being named QB1 as the end of something, or he can look at it as the beginning of the most important response of his young career. Put the head down. Work. Improve. Make Minnesota uncomfortable with the idea of giving up on you, because McCarthy has shown flashes. The criticism raised in this discussion isn't that he has never produced good NFL football. It's that he hasn't produced it consistently enough. That distinction matters. The argument presented was that McCarthy has already delivered meaningful performances, including winning on the road against Detroit and producing a 250-yard, 3-touchdown performance against Dallas with playoff implications involved. The problem is what happened around those performances. The highs demonstrated why Minnesota believed in him. The lows created the opening for Murray, and now McCarthy has to close that gap. There's another part of this story that deserves attention, though, because putting everything on McCarthy would be too easy. Kevin O'Connell's role in the quarterback's development was questioned as well. McCarthy entered his opportunity after playing at Michigan in an offense heavily supported by its running game and defense. The criticism is that Minnesota did not simplify things enough around its young quarterback or provide the kind of rushing support that could have helped him settle into NFL football. Now, with Murray taking over, the offense appears positioned to adapt more specifically to the quarterback who is actually going to start. And that might be one of the biggest reasons Minnesota made this decision when it did. McCarthy and Murray are different quarterbacks. Trying to prepare an offense around both while constantly rotating their opportunities can prevent either player from getting completely comfortable. Naming Murray QB1 allows O'Connell to stop splitting that identity and begin shaping the offense around Murray's strengths, including potentially operating more from shotgun. That also means Murray should now receive the full benefit of first-team repetitions. And this may be the detail that matters most. The suggestion is that Murray didn't necessarily win this job because he overwhelmingly dominated McCarthy in a traditional quarterback competition. Instead, Minnesota may simply have reached the point where O'Connell believed the offense needed one quarterback receiving consistent QB1 work. Brian Flores' defense had reportedly been giving the offense serious problems in practice, according to the account presented here. At some point, continuing to move quarterbacks in and out risks slowing down the development of the entire offensive unit. So Minnesota made its choice. Murray gets the offense. Murray gets the first-team work. And now we find out what happens next. But there is one comparison surrounding this decision that Vikings fans are going to immediately understand, and it involves Sam Darnold. That comparison might explain exactly what Minnesota hopes happens after officially committing to Murray. And it also tells us why writing off J.J. McCarthy right now could be premature. Before we get into that next part, I want to know where Vikings fans stand right now. If you were running Minnesota, would you keep J.J. McCarthy and wait for his value and opportunity to potentially change, or would you trade him now and take the best draft compensation available? Drop your answer in the comments, because this decision could become one of the defining quarterback stories of the Vikings season.